FromSoftware has been and always will be the king of making hard video games. Time and time again, they have reignited the market for games that are actually difficult and fun to overcome, but some challenges in their games have been a bit harder than others. These are the most painful locations I've experienced in FromSoftware RPGs. I have no experience with many FromSoftware titles, like Demon's Souls and other FromSoftware PS2 games, but at the same time, I have much experience with several classic FromSoftware RPGs. I would also like to state that I'm placing these locations in a vacuum and not in the context of other locations within their respective games. What this means is that I am considering the scenario where the player simply plunged into these levels/areas with the expected equipment. I also will sometimes give context, if incredibly necessary. I tried to vary my decisions for locations with this list as best as possible, so the Kingsfield games only got one entry apiece, though they would definitely swamp this list with the exception of another game that I will reveal by the end. With that out of the way, let's get to the list. Postscript Pooepw here. I completely forgot about Sekiro with this list, but after some reasoning, I have decided that the areas themselves are not the issue with Sekiro, but rather the bosses. For an area to be really bad, I did not just consider the boss of the area in my conclusions, but rather the area as a whole. The way the enemies are placed together, whether the environment itself is egregious to wander around, and the boss does play some part in areas, but a fair arena with a hard boss would not really come into consideration. Otherwise, the Bed of Chaos would be like number 4. Even though that's kind of a bad example, but you know what I mean. I was really grasping at straws to put Dark Souls 3 on this list. From a personal perspective, this game is simply too fair. For the average gamer, this is a good thing, but for this list's purposes, this is bad. Farron Keep Swamp is probably the only standout from the game where things are just a little fuck. The whole area is actually not too bad because poison is not the worst in this game. I tried my best to compare this to the toxic areas of this game because toxic is actually bad, but the toxic areas in this game are also super fair to the player because there's both no movement impediment in them, and they are rather short. What puts Farron Keep Swamp on this list in any capacity is that there is a small area in this location where Clorox and Windex are mixed. In a subsection of this area, the player's movement is actually impeded by the water because of how deep it is, and this is comboed with the placement of basilisks in the area. These basilisks are not that threatening to me though, since Curse is such a whatever status in Dark Souls 3. Still probably enough to make the player wince in real life, so I put this area in this 10th slot of the list. Oh my god, I love rot. Oh my god, I just want to go to the bottom of the halig tree at the roots and hug Melania. Oh my god, I love negating a whole area by being a fundamentalist. The Lake of Rot is possibly the most annoying location in the base game of Elden Ring, but I do not think it is really that bad in comparison to the other parts of the list. In my Gargora run, I remarked that I just ran right through the lake without any problems, and now this is my solution forever, probably. The problem with trying to rank this area higher on the list is that the game gives the player way too much catharsis. If the area was actually suffering, then why are there so many pressure plates to take that away? Anyway, though there are more annoying encounters in Elden Ring, I am only looking at the areas, so version 1.0 of Radon is not on this list. As an aside, this area probably beats all the other poison areas in FromSoftware games because of the constraints placed on the player by the area as well as its length. Also, it's possibly the worst kind of poison in Scarlet Rot, though there are many ways to mitigate it. I would lastly like to apologize for not having a vanilla recording of this area. I am playing a convergence mod run right now on this channel, and I do not feel like dealing with the hassle of turning off the mod and turning it back on. When talking about bad locations in FromSoftware RPGs, it is a classic maneuver to put Blighttown on the list, but I posit a different format for this entry, in that I only think that the original Blighttown from Dark Souls 1 is horrendous. The location in general is actually not as bad as many people would put it. I even think that people actually had a worse experience in Sen's Fortress, which is actually absent on this list. Poison is at its weakest in Dark Souls 1, Kellogg is not really that unfair of a boss, and the place is littered with cool loot, unlike many locations in the game. However, original Blighttown possesses a psychological effect that many locations in Dark Souls 1 do not have. Lag. Playing Blighttown with all the laggy features of the original makes this bog actually bog down the player. I feel like this is the true reason that everyone uses the terminology of calling bad places in Soulsborne games Blighttown, and that's why I give it the 8th slot of this list, and I give it directly to specifically original Dark Souls 1 Blighttown, not remastered. Remastered is way too simple and way too easy, way too fine. The area is so small, technically. Alright, I know I said I wasn't going to put another Elden Ring place, and I said the last place was the worst location, but actually do not explore Ordina Liturgical Town at 3 a.m. Oh my god, bros. Welcome back to another Dark Web video. Today we're exploring the town of Ordina in the consecrated Snowfield. During the day, this quaint town is an innocuous and devoid part of the game, with some goodies scattered around it. But at night... No, not the real night. I mean the nighttime in the book, not real night. The town becomes haunted by spooky ghosts. This is all just my cutesy way of saying that the game throws invisible enemies at you. This is not the only place with invisible enemies, mind you. It just so happens that there is more than one of them. What really does not help with this area is that the usual invisible enemy that is copy-pasted here had their dial turned to 11. It always feels like the backstab from the assassins here wipe out over half health and occasionally all health. I really did feel as though this experience warranted this placement on the list. At least you can see the enemies and the poison in Blighttown. And also, while I was writing this, I forgot that you have to do parkour with a bunch of archers. That's super painful, isn't it? Okay, now we are speaking my language. Probably much to the chagrin of people who played through Dark Souls 2. The poison area of Dark Souls 2, the gutter, is actually not the Blighttown of this game. In fact, I would say that that area, the gutter again, is a beautiful area with cool little secrets and a built-in minigame held within that is lighting all the torches. The area that will never get a pass from me and that will always give me The area that will never get a pass from me and that will always make me groan is the Shrine of Amana. That's the water area. Featuring one of the most taboo things in modern day Let me redo the whole thing. The area that will never get a pass from me and that always makes me groan is the Shrine of Amana. Featuring one of the most taboo things in modern day FromSoftware games, water, this area is an aquatic hellscape. Where many games try to clear the jump of trying to make their water levels fun, the developers of Dark Souls 2 answered with a resounding pain in bold letters. For many new players, this area will be hell if they never leveled up the adaptability because their already poor rolling they do will be made even poorer by the water spanning the entire area. If you do not know, water inhibits your rolling in this game. You can fully experience this with the Flexile Sentry boss. To add to the pain of this area, the developers of this game added the uppercut slam combo of putting casters in this area. Casters who cut your health by so much with hard to dodge attacks. But that is not the end of the story, as the Archdukes here are really annoying melee enemies with super soft attacks that hit hard. You will be stun locked. The developers even said fuck it and barricaded a third of the area with guys that break your shit. This place is no fun. Also, it is probably one of the contenders for a place that most epitomizes the phrase, hard area, easy boss, since the boss is just a whittle skeleton trying to play froggy. He's just a whittle guy. We are on the bottom half of the list, so you know what that means. This is the first entry on the list that includes a classic FromSoftware game, and to preface the oncoming storm that is the next 4 areas on the list, I would like to set the axis of why these areas are far worse than modern FromSoftware games. There's some key components and mechanics of these games that make them far more annoying than any area in a modern FromSoftware game could ever be, with the most important ones being that the player cannot save wherever they feel like, and the player is on tank controls in first person. These games control like Bubsy 3D. With that out of the way, I can now talk about this entry. There are probably 2 annoying locations in Kingsfield 1, but I just felt it would be unfair and even overpowering to the list if I included multiples for these games. But I will say, between floor 4 and floor 5, with floor 5 being the most other painful location in this game, floor 4 has more pizzazz to its pain. Floor 5 is just the level of the game where the enemies are the most powerful and in high numbers, but this is to be expected since it's the last level of the game. On the other hand, floor 4 causes psychological harm to the player. What sets floor 4 apart from the other parts of the game is the longevity of the pain the player must endure. This floor is filled to the brim with pathways that diverge and loop back through the whole floor, and the player must find the correct path to escape to floor 5 in order to acquire the Moonlight Greatsword and defeat the Dark Magician. This looping of the floor, alongside the confusing map of Kingsfield 1, are pain for the player. On top of all this game came out in 1994, which means that the music options were limited. And by that I mean that the player had to endure a brief singular track all throughout this floor, which is enough to drive someone to madness. As a footnote, this place may be one of the contenders for most amount of secrets in a FromSoftware game, due to the large amount of hidden doors, which is prevalent in many of the Kingsfield games. There's actually another location later on this list that beats this probably, but they probably are pretty close. Very annoying place in this game, but still not enough to make me hate it, even though it is literally 1/5 of the game.
I'm mining.
Okay, I have to admit that the termite cave was pretty bad in this game, but the area I decided to pick for this game to add to this list had to be the big mine for other reasons. As this is a list that is determined based on the ratio of characters' capabilities to progression in the game as a whole, Big Mine from Kingsfield 2 is a tragedy for the player to encounter. The main problem of Big Mine as a whole is that it is simply too early for the player to accidentally encounter. Big Mine is a location that is pretty much available to the player after the first town of the game. It is a side pathway from the main pathway the player is supposed to take and is mentioned much by the NPCs residing in the game. Before I rant about the annoyance this location presents, it is very important for me to introduce the concept of rhombus keys. Rhombus keys are a key item in Kingsfield 2 that the player acquires in high amounts. If the player did not have to spend rhombus keys, the player could probably end the game with double digits of rhombus keys in their inventory. What does a rhombus key do, you might ask? The rhombus key is just as it says in the name, a key. These keys open doors that are scattered throughout Kingsfield 2, but these doors have a strange locking mechanism to them. You need 2 keys to go both ways through a rhombus door. With that out of the way, I can now tell you that Big Mine has 3 dud doors to go through. What I mean by this is that the player can get locked out of continuing the game if they run out of keys and walk through the door. Getting locked out of continuing the game is actually rather common in this game, hence the existence of the teleportation system in the game. This is all to say that Big Mine is literally a pain to deal with without even going through the gate. And that's just the start. There's a poison area here, a darkness area here, and a bunch of pitfalls scattered around the place. The player has to ride a minecart in this area, and there's a good chance they will fall off of it into the endless abyss below. To add to all this, the area connects to one of the hardest areas in the game. All this centralizes around how easy it is the developers made it to accidentally stumble into this location, so it is definitely a painful location.
Put your faith in the light!
This was probably one of the last ones that I put on this list, so it took me a while to think about whether or not there actually was a horrible place in Kingsfield 4, but I found it, and so here we are. When presenting this location, it comes with the same caveat as Big Mine. The player can get here too easily and too early as I did. Without doing some steps before entering this area, the player is met with a constant debuff that is the most devastating debuff to date for a Kingsfield game. The screen becomes all red, and the player becomes incapable of casting spells. The error drains the player's mana as well as the meter to cast spells in the first place. Now with the debuff of the area fully explained, aka the first tooth we had to pull being in this place, let me take out the rest of your teeth by telling you that this place may have the singular strongest enemy and the most annoying enemy pasted throughout this area. As in, those are 2 different enemies. The player is intended to kill what is essentially the Dark Souls 1 Iron Golem, with 3 of them being present throughout the passage without any magic. They are each in a tiny little room. While walking through the parts without them, the player is lambasted by bird enemies that are hard to hit. Again, since the player cannot cast any magic. Let's take a step back for a moment though. Strong enemies and annoying enemies in this game are actually pretty fine to deal with in Kingsfield games. Eventually the player can find a way to cheese them either by strafing or stun locking. What really sets this place apart is the inclusion of the lightning pylons present in the rooms with the iron golems. For some reason, this game harkens back to the random twist of Kingsfield 2 where there are sci-fi elements in this fantasy-style game. These pylons deal massive, constant damage and cannot be killed. With their radius of damage, they take up 70% of each of the rooms, with 4 in each room. It is this combination of things that makes this area one of the worst places to end up in a FromSoftware game. As a final note for this part, the area does become easier if the player progresses properly by killing an enemy much later in the game, but, to reiterate, this area is very easy to stumble into too early because of it being one of the only open passageways in the slightly early part of the game.
Death to all of them.
Do I even need to explain this one? You should be able to immediately infer that this place sucks shit when it is literally called the Passage of Death. Yet another location that is vying for the #1 spot of FromSoftware location with the most amount of secrets, and it might be this one actually. The Passage of Death is possibly one of the simplest locations in Kingsfield 3 at first glance. It is simply a rectangle, with a path in the middle filled to the brim with booby traps. But should the player spam the activate button enough, they will find that the area has a plethora of secret doors to aid with going around the traps. The problem here is that the secret doors do not fully enable the player to evade the traps. Without the help of an online map made by someone else, the player will be forced to traipse around the secret passageways only to discover they have likely gone the wrong way and will be forced to go back through dangerous swinging pendulums and saws hanging from the ceiling. This version 0.1 of Sense Fortress is easily a location that is Sense Fortress pre-nerf. Oh, and did I mention, this area has enemies too. Strong enemies. All because this is the area right before the last area. Such a painful location.
No, 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 no! Wait! Wait!
If over half the video is just this game, I apologize in advance. To boil down the experience that is Shadow Tower, I am going to have to take this bit by bit. First off, the game is an old FromSoftware game, so the entire game is played with only tank controls. The player turns himself left and right and then moves forward with the only bit of grace given to them being that the player can also strafe. If I were to give this game and its locations the luxury of considering it from the viewpoint of someone already accustomed to the controls of old FromSoftware games, then this point is actually fine. The enemies are largely built around the tank controls being a hindrance throughout the early FromSoftware games. For everyone else, this is shitty. Playing a game that requires dodging without actual dodges is hard to adapt to. Branching off the classic FromSoftware feel, I have to mention point number 2, which is that this game is actually a sensory deprivation chamber. There is no music. This game barely has any sounds at all throughout the horrors the player has to experience, which actually adds to the emotional pain the player feels when they do encounter enemies that make noise. What really does not help is that the noises they make are randomly creepy. This game was not really intended to be directly a horror game, so when the creepy homunculus sitting in the corner is making his noise, it bites more. Which brings me to my third point, the monsters. This game has the creepiest and most annoying monsters. This game also largely epitomizes the feeling of stupid hard regular mobs and easy bosses. Of all the enemies in the game, I think the most annoying creature in terms of player scaling to location the player is supposed to be has to be all of the enemies in Fireworld. If the player never does any exploration and plays the game as expected by roaming around worlds and doing them in order, they will encounter the Zeus-like fire creature that can seemingly hit the player from anywhere at any time in the first part of the Fireworld. The fire damage this monster deals is egregious, nearly one-shotting the player in the context of this part of the game. And what is the reward for destroying such a creature who is so hard to kill because they attack so fast and stunlock the player? Nothing. The player gets no items. This is because the game follows a loot system where the player has a chance to get things from enemies, which means that while they could get some consumable to use from the enemies they slay, which is still functionally nothing, by the way, there's a good chance they will get nothing. And actually, I've got to confess, that was the first of many two-faced lies. I believe that this enemy drops a small level up consumable, guaranteed. I know it drops something guaranteed. There are guaranteed drops. But that was actually a two-faced lie, but they're usually consumables which are most of the time functionally nothing. I think this one actually doesn't even drop something that is useful immediately. I think it's like a coin. So actually, I take that back, but it is still functionally nothing. Which brings me to the fourth point. There are many points for this game being a painful experience for the player. The equipment and loot system of the whole game. Never have you experienced the pain that your equipment suffers than in Shadow Tower. Playing Shadow Tower is like playing Minecraft with only gold and wood equipment through the whole way, except it is actually worse. Many items have around 5 durability. That's right, we are working with single digits in this one. And this is not some kind of deflated number when it comes to durability. When you swing that weapon and hit something, there's a good chance your 5 durability will be slapped down to a 4. Now, this is not all bad. It is only really the early game weapons that have this single-digit durability. The problem is that many of these weapons start with 5 durability rather than the full bar. Now you may be asking, what happens if durability becomes 0? The answer, my dear friend, is that that piece of equipment is gone. Functionally unusable until repaired, which requires trading in your health to fix. You heard me right. The blacksmith for this game trades in health points for fixing weapons. I may have also led you on by talking about this like it only applies to weapons, but this also applies to everything you wear. Every piece of equipment will drain the player of their health, making the fountain drink, Sprite, the most valuable resource of the game. I call it Sprite because it looks a lot like the beverage. And all this talk about health points brings me to mention a fifth frustrating point about this game being the player stats. Player stats make no sense. People can complain all they want that Dark Souls 2 has an annoying stat in ADP which is required to effectively roll in the game, or how the resistance stat in Dark Souls 1 is a joke stat. But those pale in comparison to the 14 stats the player has in this game, with so many of them practically being duds. If I were to make an analogy to the stats of modern-day FromSoftware games, this would be like if in Elden Ring, there was a stat specifically for your ability to deal Scarlet Rot to something. That's it. Not like Arcane where it affects multiple different combat capabilities. Also, the names really do not help. For instance, Strength, or STR, does not affect your ability to deal damage in this game. This is actually the health stat. This game has the FromSoftware Classic weapon denomination of Bounce, Slash, Smash, or Strike as it was changed to in the modern games, and Pierce, but since you can level them, pretty much any weapon can deal any type of damage. But don't think this means you can have fun with your fists. I forgot to mention that there is no attack you can perform in this game without a weapon, meaning you are defenseless without them. As an aside to shed light on something where the last 2 points eclipse each other, I would like to state that this game does secretly provide the player with some relief in exploitable clothing. For some reason, clothes provide health in this game. Almost all of them. This means the player can don the most powerful health-increasing armor, drink their Sprite, and then repair their equipment, something the player has to figure out on their own. As another side in the same vein as this previous point, this was to be expected, but there is in fact passive health and mana regeneration in this game from equipment, meaning that the durability stuff does become a moot point at a certain moment in the game. Early FromSoftware games largely have passive regeneration items in them, but they are much later, and I will bring this part of the video to a close by presenting the last point of why this game as a whole is so painful. Looking back at this, wow, I have never told a lie so bold in a video before. There are many parts of the game that I have not gone into detail about, but I would be remiss to not mention the most frustrating part of this game in that the story makes no fucking sense. There's barely any sense of direction in this game. The player is mostly just put into Shadow Tower and then expected to know exactly what to do. The Mole Man does tell the player that they have to kill the 6 rulers of the worlds, but his guidance and cuteness alone does not explain anything. Clearly the world of Shadow Tower is that demons rule the domain the player roams through, but why do they help the player? Why does the demon lady that the player helps randomly fight inside of a tiny secluded room while speaking right beforehand in a way that seems like she's going to fight them somewhere else? How come the mole man broke my playthrough by cycling every single line of dialogue in the game? This actually happened to me on stream, by the way. All of this without explanation, and the ending is purposeless. People like to complain all the time that games or shows or media in general likes to produce scripts that are endlessly extendable. This game wastes the player's time by basically saying that the cycle will perpetuate itself, meaning that everything will start over, which is exactly what happens in this game. You beat the game, and you are put back at the beginning. This is a galaxy-sized bra moment. As I said earlier, I didn't even get through all the BS that permeates this game. I'm going to take this moment to speed through just a few of them, another two-faced lie. There is more than one poison area in this game. When I say poison area, I do not mean level. What I mean is sets of levels with poison. I said it before, but this game has a soft lock, which triggered in my playthrough. Actually, go back to the poison. I said earlier that poison is probably at its worst in FromSoftware games in Elden Ring's Lake of Rot. That was another lie, or rather maybe a bit of a misconstrued point. Modern FromSoftware games that is the worst poison. Classic FromSoftware games poison is the worst poison. It is very painful. You're going to lose all your health probably. Anyway, on to the next list thing. I said it before, but this game has a soft lock, which triggered in my playthrough. If I were playing on actual hardware with real saves, my save would be bricked. There's an infinite healing pool plus blacksmith combo near each other, but the path between them is arduous, creating a psychologically obnoxious loop the player could get stuck in. The first boss the player has to fight is right after a narrow pathway the player can fall off of that has no rails. The tank controls do add to the pain. Speaking of tank controls, this game has a surprising number of ranged enemies for an early FromSoftware game. Tank controls and ranged enemies are like oil and water. This is a problem that I feel early FromSoftware games have in general, but the visual effects of status debuffs hurt my eyes and hurt the experience of the game, if they do not already hurt my eyes. Why is Minecraft's darkness in these games? This game feels like it immediately rewards speedrunning, which to me is a bad thing because it means that the breadth of the game was constructed in a way that it was meant to be skipped. The player can reach overpowered weapons quickly and early, which is why I mention this. There are invisible enemies in this game. I will not elaborate further. There are shields in this game, but they are painful to use. Since the tank controls take up the top buttons of the controller, the square button, or X button on Xbox controllers, is the block button. This makes the ideal handling of a controller the claw style, but more carpal tunnel inducing. There is a load screen for putting on equipment in certain slots. I repeat, there is a load screen for putting on your items and taking them off. The game has no map. With games in general, sometimes this is a good thing, and I would actually say that this is one of the minor offenses the game presents. It honestly feels like the game's areas were so small that the developers thought the player did not need a map. You have to kill some harmless NPCs in this game to do certain things. Not a pet peeve of mine, but sorry to all the pacifists out there. And that is my list of BS I wanted to rattle off. Now, as much as I give this game flack, I still enjoyed it. In fact, there was one feature in the game that was actually kind of cool, the Pokédex. In this game, for some reason, the player keeps a list of all info of all creatures they slay or come across, including harmless NPCs. This gave some cool lore, but more importantly, although I didn't take advantage of this, enabled the player to kill exactly the enemies they wanted to in order to level up specific stats. That's right, the Pokédex isn't the only Pokemon mechanic in this game. This game has EV training. I don't mention this because it seemed like a good thing, but enemies do not just drop experience in this one, they drop stat increases. There is no direct indicator for which stat increases, but it happens. All in all, I cannot recommend this game to players if they are playing it on an actual PS1 or PS2. It is simply too painful to deal with reloading saves constantly and potentially losing a save. Emulating/modding the game feels a ton better because of the save states. But if you are a hardcore gamer, then I guess this is FromSoftware game of PS1 for you. Enjoy the double poison areas and lack of durability, you filthy, filthy masochist. And with that, that is my top 10 worst areas in FromSoftware games. If you thought all these areas were actually the most fun and easy areas in the game and that I am just a butthurt casual, then I recommend recalling your first experience with them. Not so easy calling me a casual noob when you were at some point, is it? Meta commentary aside, I still love these games regardless of them having these areas that paint the picture of artificial difficulty in the minds of the people who first encounter them. I hope to play more FromSoftware games in order to find more bullshit areas than any of the areas on this list.